On Monday, February 4th, students across the province of Ontario came out to protest against the Ford administration's austerity policies. The main target of these policies was education. Considering the publication of government data showing that as many as 40% of full-time domestic Ontario college students made use of full tuition grants in 2017, it is rather surprising as well to see such a turnout.
So what the Ford government has done is that it's introduced a series of changes which will end up dramatically increasing the cost of post-secondary education, in particular for working class students.
Marco Lagrota is an editor for FIBA magazine and is familiar with Ford's policies and its effects.
To go into the details, one of the things he's removing is the program which previously provided students from families earning less than $50,000 a year with effectively free tuition. Now, of course, it wasn't completely free education. They still had to pay for textbooks, they still had to pay for the cost of living. But now what's happened is that instead of having those grants for them, which covered the cost of tuition, those students will now be forced to take on loans, which will effectively increase the cost of their education by thousands of dollars every year, which ends up making it more difficult for a working class student to pursue a post-secondary education. The Ford government's also getting rid of the 6-month interest-free period which students previously had, which meant that when they graduated, they didn't immediately collect interest on those loans until after 6 months after the time they graduated. But now that's been abolished, which means that from the day after they graduate, they'll now be collecting interest from the very beginning.
The protest was organized almost spontaneously, with a couple of students launching a Facebook page being met with the swift reaction of thousands of responses pledging their presences from students throughout the province.
The Ford government's also getting rid of the 6-month interest-free period which students previously had, which meant that when they graduated, they didn't immediately collect interest on those loans until after 6 months after the time they had graduated. But now that's been abolished, which means that from the day after they graduate, they'll now be collecting interest from the very beginning.
One of the most telling signs of the interest that these policies serve is the Student Choice Initiative, designed to fund student unions by offering students the possibility of paying less for their education as long as they take their union fees out.
The Ford government has introduced what's known as the Student Choice Initiative. And essentially what this does is it hinders students' ability to fight back against these cuts. Essentially what he's done is he's given students the option to refuse to pay certain fees that every student is compelled to pay in post-secondary education. However, the interesting thing is that most of these fees are still mandatory according to Ford. So for example, things like athletic facilities and walk-safe programs are still mandatory. And really what that leaves are student unions, campus newspapers, and things like that. In other words, those same organizations and those same bodies which have been mounting an opposition and mounting the resistance to the Ford government. Effectively what he's done is introduce the equivalent of right-to-work legislation, which you see being implemented by Republican legislators across the United States with the purpose of undermining the union and undermining unity, in this case of students. So it's an incredibly callous attack which has been made, an incredibly blatant attack, and we think it needs to be resisted by all means necessary.
In the months since, students throughout the province have risen up in disgust to these attacks on education. Even high school students have walked out of their classes. Considering that their very futures are at stake, it's hard not to sympathize.